Right, we'll get started. Welcome to this Friday's INTEROPen Curation Call. My name is Munish Jakhani, and I'm clinical lead within NHS Digital for FHIR Curation and Integration projects. I'm going to chair this call. You're all muted on entry. This is an interactive session, so as the presenters talk about the content, please feel free to raise your hand. If you have any question, I'll bring you in, and please unmute yourself and you can ask your question. You can also put your question and comments in the chat window, which I'll be monitoring. This WebEx is being recorded, and we'll share the recording on FHIR later on. The presentation is already published on FHIR. And once again, the purpose of this call is to talk about pathology and test results and the FHIR design for those from the perspective of three programs, the CCIO7 pathology program, the GP to GP, and GP Connect. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Pete Salisbury.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. I'll be going through a bit of background, so a little bit about the programs that we're developing for or developing models for, and then we'll be talking through some of the key discussion points. So what resources we're going to use, the various options where we need to pick a certain option, and there's more than one way of doing it, particularly test groups, and then talking through some of the other things like dealing with textual results and pathology, and dealing with comments that are added to results when they're filed, sample types, those sorts of things. So as Manish was saying, there are three projects that are involved in the curation. I guess our aim is to, so we've got GP Connect, who are looking to export data from GPs, the National Pathology Programme, who are looking at various different things, including the blood sciences in particular at the moment, and they'll be working their way through and trying to write things like a unified code list, which is I'm sure Phil Brennan will talk about a bit later, and the GPIT Futures Patient Record Migration team, who are looking at practice migrations and GP to GP, and again they'll be here talking a little bit about their project too. So for my part, I'm obviously from the GP Connect program. I've worked a lot on GP to GP as well. I guess most of you will probably know a bit about GP Connect. I guess the background is really that it's an API that we're trying to develop that will expose GP data from the GP system suppliers via the spine to a variety of different care settings. So GP practices, shared records, social care, hospitals, for patient self-care as well, 111, things like that. There are a number of different strands in the GP Connect program. There's a HTML view, which is sort of read-only view of the patient record. There's ability to book and amend appointments. There's the bit that we're interested in really from this call is the structured data. So we're interested in exposing the data from GP practices in a structured format that then people can use. So it's machine readable as well as just patient readable. Patient readable. So the scope of GP Connect is to look at, I suppose, it's not just our scope, but we're looking at developing a logical model that will replace the EDIFACT message. We're aware as well that there are other test results that will have to use the observation resource, so we want to make sure that the way we curate the models will work for those as well. And then there's also a case of test report and test result documents. So, for instance, it could be interesting to be able to send the EDIFACT message as it's received at the GP. But for the moment, really, we're looking at primarily replacing the EDIFACT message And while we're doing that, we want to develop a model that will also support future data models. So we've been working with the National Pathology Programme, who are then going to introduce a more structured message for certain areas, and we want to make sure that any model that we develop will be able to support those models in the future.
So, Pete, I've got a question. Jonathan, do you want to come in?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I'm working on various aspects of this. I chaired the message development group that produced what you're referring to as the EDIFACT message. I'm really concerned about that slide describing scope. Does all other test results mean all other investigations?
Well, I'm talking from a GP perspective, so it could be blood pressure, it could be,
yep.
You know,
a radiology report.
It could be a height, or it could be something as simple as that.
Thank you. So that's within the HL7 FHIR definition of observations. That's an enormous scope, isn't it?
Yes, but as I was just saying, that for the purpose of this curation, we're going to concentrate on the pathology. We're not going to concentrate on like the test results and the test result documents. So they're out of scope for the moment. So we know they exist, and we don't want to develop a model that will inhibit us sending those things. So they're in our mind as we're developing the model, but they're out of scope for the moment.
Who is carrying the risk that the logical model that supports one, which I know intimately, is extensible for the other roles that are needed?
Sorry, what do you mean by that exactly?
Okay, the logical model of the EDIFACT message is a very stripped down version of HL7 version 2. Yeah.
So I think
it's actually ASTM 1238. Everything was thrown away in order to get something that could be implemented very quickly.
So I think what we have done here, Jonathan, is we haven't started with EDIFACT. We have started with a logical data model, which is generic.
Great.
Right.
And then you have an instance that you will make sure will be able to replace what's currently being used for the EDIFACT message. Yes.
What we have done is, first of all, the data model we have is agnostic of EDIFACT, okay? That was developed. And then once we have this agnostic data model, we looked at EDIFACT to say, okay, now how our data model is going to satisfy what's in the EDIFACT message. We have done that.
Yes. I think it would be really helpful if it said that in the documents.
Yeah, I think...
Which it doesn't at the moment. Okay, I'll take that. That's really helpful to hear it put like that. But
no, that's really good feedback, and we'll absolutely take that into consideration.
Okay, the next question is the one of scope. So if you go back a position there, you've got a GP aspect, you've got a laboratory aspect. Now, clinicians only see a small amount of the information flows that goes across things related to laboratory medicine. Yeah, that which includes, from the national project, for example, laboratory to quality assurance system, laboratory to central reporting systems. They have requirements at the data level that clinicians never see. Does Munish's answer about the scope of this also apply to those? That you want the big scope, but there are some early deliverables, or are those out of scope?
So I will let Phil come in from Path Pathology Program. Phil, do you want to take this?
Sorry. Finley and Jack Kohler. And all I can do is really reiterate what Pete said. So the initial iteration of the work we're doing, certainly from a national pathology perspective, the focus is on blood sciences, so hematology and chemical pathology. But we are absolutely aware that of the need to, in future iterations, consider other pathology disciplines. But our scope does include primary and secondary care.
Okay, so those, I understand that in terms of disciplines. I'm worried about it because we were already sending microbiology reports, dynamic test results to clinicians, and this has a lower scope than that. But the other question was, from a laboratory's point of view, it's a bit that works quite well getting the reports out to clinicians. Because of the lack of data standards, they have a real problem in many other tasks that are facing them. And again, I would follow Munish's line and say, please, can those be in the big scope? Although certain deliverables may come earlier than others, For a great example of that in the logical model is, do you need 2 accession numbers? If you're sending work between 2 laboratories, you need 2 accession numbers, but a clinician will never see them. But they're crucial to the logical model. Yes, and it's that kind of level of detail that we have picked up on in this initial iteration. So that specific example, actually, we have picked up on. So yeah, I mean that slide there is my slide, and hopefully that sets out what I've just summarised. So I know it's not ideal because we want to design everything up front and get everything included from day one. But I guess the reality of the work we're doing, especially within the national pathology area, is for this initial iteration for this current financial year, that has been our formal scope as set out by the CCIO. But fully understand your concerns around the wider scope and the need to support a much wider base. Okay, so thank you for that. I won't pursue the argument there. Who's the SRO for that slide, please? Ultimately, it's Simon Eccles, so the CCIO. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so I think, Jonathan, what we're saying is in this iteration, and this is iterative design, this is not, this is the first version we're going to create. Lab to lab is out of scope. And as we go through another sprint later on, we might include and enhance the data model. But data model itself, as I said, is a logical model, which if we think when we get to lab, we can add things to it. Okay. But I think...
I'm new to this, I don't want to take it over, but I must warn you that not having the scope right at the state where you create the logical data model almost guarantees an enormous amount of reworking when the next thing comes into scope. Now, that is not true of implementation. Yeah, you can implement incrementally, but the idea that you can go back having created a logical data model and put big things like that into it that weren't considered originally carries a lot of risk.
Okay. Okay, that's, I think, something programs to consider as a risk. They will have to manage it. And I think at the moment, the way this sprint is set up, I think we'll have to just go with the scope we got, and then we'll revisit. And I think maybe you're right. We'll get to that situation. But I think that is something, Phil, you need to capture as a program.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, Jonathan, you've already shared those concerns. I mean, all I can do is reiterate is that the focus of this work and for the national pathology team as a whole has stemmed from that initial bullet point there. So that one of the key interoperability priorities from the CCIO. So that ability to share basic pathology results. But yeah, fully understand concerns.
Right, we should move on. Pete, do you want to carry on from where you were? Is that all right, Johnson? Your hand is still up. Did you have any further comments? Thank you. Okay, carry on, Pete.
So I think I've talked around the GP Connect scope, which I think is very much GP focused, and it's about being able to send what the GP can see. And again, when we're just looking at the things that they receive via an ENIPAT message in this part. Did you want to talk more about your slide, Phil?
There's not much more to say, really.
You go through it all.
Yeah, that's unless people got any more specific questions around that, I mean that is kind of where we're at. So we've got a use case later on in the slide deck, which covers requesting, but only really provide context, as it states there, and as we've said from the start of this presentation, the focus is on reporting, but just provide some business level context. We have considered requesting as well at a high level. So no, unless anybody's got any more questions on that slide, that's kind of it.
Okay, I'll move on then. Is John Levy on the call?
Yep.
Hi, John. You go.
Hi. Yep, sure. Yep. So recently, obviously, as GPIT Futures is coming in, one of the kind of key areas for them is to look and understand how we're calling it patient record migration now. So how we effectively transfer and move data around between in a GDPR world, which is different from sharing. It's different from programs like SCR or the LICRAs, and it's about how ownership and kind of the data processors and the data controllers, how they all kind of safely, securely migrate patient data between themselves. As patients and practices either change, because they've moved house, or from a patient point of view, or practices, when they decide to switch software supplier. One of our first key focus is actually around the current GP to GP. So measuring its current performance, identifying areas for improvement, and then effectively or hopefully trying to reduce the failure rate in the current version of GP to GP. But in the future, given the NHS, its current strategic direction is to move to FHIR-based messaging, we thought this was a good time to kind of get involved and start understanding if this is what the future looks like, what does our data look like in terms of the HL7v3 message for GP to GP, and how it would fit in a future world, because we're going to have lots of quote unquote legacy information we've got to transfer around, and if we were to use this new profile, would that be possible, etc., etc. We believe we've got quite a similar scope to GP Connect, because we just care about the data and it getting across, and that sounds simple, but as I'm sure we all know, is very difficult. And so yeah, that's probably about it for me.
So I think I got a question for you from John Williams.
Hi there, thanks very much. Just wondered if you could clarify, perhaps give some examples of what you mean when you use the phrase failure rate of GP to GP. Is that failure in terms of record transmission and receipt, or is it failure as in inability to handle certain kinds of content, or is it both? Could you just clarify, please?
I think it's easier to say all of the above. I think so. To give some examples, for instance, we know that the fallback to paper and the transfer of the large George record doesn't currently meet the goals of kind of paperless of a paperless world. And whilst that's a lofty ambition to say we're going to get everything across, obviously it's still, at the moment, there's still a requirement that the large George record is sent. And the kind of the stuff that couldn't be sent is printed off and things like that. We're considering that failure, but that's failure in a very long-term way. So that isn't the focus of our initial set of failures. Our initial set of failures is things like, why didn't this GP to GP message work? For instance, let's say because of incompatibility between versions, because they tried, this is a large message and so it can't be sent to a 1.1 practice. And things like that. So it's looking at those areas first, then kind of moving out into, well, if something bad happens in registration, how does that affect the GP to GP transfer? Does it allow it to happen or not? And then moving out again into, well, how would we make it so that there is no need for the paper to come at all?
Okay, that's very helpful. Can I just follow up?
Of course.
I mean, the first thing you mentioned obviously links into the business around digitization of Lloyd George envelopes.
Yeah.
Probably not. This is not the place to have a long discussion about the pros and cons of that.
Yes.
But what I want to ask you is, what about a problem like the current difficulty in GP to GP in handling interoperability of drug allergies? Is that would you recognize that as, in quotes, a failure of GP to GP? The reason for raising it is, as an ex-clinical safety lead of GP to GP, it worries me that that's a residual safety problem which still hasn't been addressed.
Yeah, and I think
do you want me to talk about that, John, quickly?
I'll do one sentence and see if it covers your answer. But please, yes, Pete definitely knows more about this than I do. But yeah, I think that is definitely on our list. I think that the initial work is to look at the kind of the perception of GP to GP failure, and to make sure that that perception is true, false? Is it better than it is? Is it worse than it is? And to make sure that everyone's on the same page about the current state. And only then, once we're kind of understanding getting through those, what are kind of technical difficulties first, with a mind to understanding quality and saying, where is data quality causing clinical safety issues after that?
That's very helpful. I mean, clearly all the stuff you're talking about is vitally important, but I just wanted to check about the safety issue as well. Thank you very much.
Pete, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, John, that the allergy archetype is a day one requirement for GPIT futures.
Still, Pete, still a day one requirement. That's been a top requirement for us for a long time, hasn't it?
Yes. I won't disagree with that, but it's definitely in as a day one requirement for GPIT futures, and suppliers will be obliged.
Excellent.
And yeah, I think that's it from me now, unless there's any more questions.
No more questions, carry on.
So yeah, I think it's the next slide. Oh, yeah, please. All right, I'll hand over whoever's taking over next.
Yeah, that's me. So we have a high level logical model for what we're going to curate. So obviously it's all about test reporting really, and so the test report is obviously the vital part of that, and it can relate to a number of test groups, which could relate to, in turn, to a number of test results. The test report would also link to test results directly, and all of those things can link to the specimen. There are a number of other sort of areas we've been looking at. So within the test report, there's likely to be a summary of the test request, and also it's possible for clinicians to add comments as they file reports. So that's another area we're looking at. As I mentioned previously, we did talk about test report documents. So that could be, in the test report document might be the actual EDIFACT document the GP receives the results in, and with left space if we did ever want to send them as part of the message, and also with left space for results that might come as a document, whether that be an image or a graph or something like that too. It's worth as well, where we say test groups, there are many names for test groups. They can be called batteries, panels, profiles, and we've gone for kind of a neutral name, but really we define test groups anything the lab has deemed a group of tests. So obviously the language is key there, and sometimes different names mean different. There's many names to call test groups, just to recognise that. So some example use cases. Phil, this is.
So Pete, I got a question. Jonathan.
Mm-hmm. Go back to the model.
Is there a concept of a report that relates to more than one specimen?
Yes, we've modelled it so that a report could have many specimens.
Thank you. Is there a status of report, interim, overwrite, final?
I think
I think the diagnostic report profile has got a status in it.
Yeah, it's a required field in FHIR, so that there are certain statuses that you have to use.
Okay. There's a link there. Yeah. Does that include the sort of questions and answers we've just done?
Yep. Yes. Oh no, not yes, it will.
I think that's actually a link to a more detailed version of the model, which might not answer the questions you've just done. But in the spreadsheet, so the DDM, which obviously you're probably more interested in the detail, you'd be able to look through the DDM, which goes through field by field, and you can see the cardinalities.
Yep, thank you for that. You see, the bit I don't understand is, I know that these are all there in FHIR because they're all there from HL7 2.1 onwards. The question is, I don't know what's being taken out in order to cover the scope that was in the earlier slide. How do we find out about things that if you knew about HL7, you would know that they were there, as in the answer to the question you just gave, but someone has taken them out for this project?
Well, nothing has been taken out, Jonathan. The principle of design of FHIR is that we never delete anything from the international FHIR profiles anyway. All the time we'll delete anything from the international profile if we can find a clinical safety issue, which we haven't found in this case. So we're going to use the generic information profile with some UK tailoring, which we're going to discuss today. But apart from that, as a scope, we are going to use the international FHIR profile as close to as possible.
Okay, I don't want to prolong this bit. That sounds inconsistent with the previous answers on scope, but we'll take that afterwards. Thanks.
Okay.
Any other questions on the model?
No, carry on.
Phil?
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, so this next slide presents a very simplified generic process flow for test requesting and reporting. And as I said on one of my previous slides, obviously the focus of the work we're doing is reporting, but just for context, this slide does talk about requesting as well. It's very, as you can see, it's very simple, so there are no exception flows. It's very much a happy path view of a typical process. Obviously, there'll be a lot of variation in process depending on the particular care setting, the type of sample, where the sample's collected, etc. As I said, there are no exception flows, for example, handling missing samples or samples that can't be used. But hopefully provides some context, and it also introduces down the left-hand side some of the key groups of actors in terms of organisations and practitioners that are involved in the process and are supported by the FHIR model. So I don't know if anybody's got any questions of that. Appreciate it's quite difficult to read, but hopefully you can make some sense of it. If not, if we can move on to the next slide, Pete, please.
Yeah.
Jonathan, your hand is up. Is it from previous time, or you've got another question?
Out of scope, please. Scheduled testing without an explicit request, point of care testing, and patient-initiated testing.
I didn't catch the start of that question. Sorry, Jonathan.
Okay, you've got that. You described that as generic. That's generic for a classical request report cycle, but there are lots of others, such as scheduled tests without explicit requests, point of care testing, and patient-initiated testing.
Yes, yeah. I mean, for basically, given the time constraints we've got on this call, the slide we're looking at now focuses on primary care, which, as I say, is that classic pathway. But we do recognise there are variations and other.
So, again, I'm not asking for flows. I'm asking a question about scope. Is this product supposed to support patient-initiated testing? For example, anticoagulant work. Is it supposed to include point of care testing?
So I think I can take this one.
Okay.
Hey, hi, Jonathan. So I think we need to be pragmatic about how we look at this. As you pointed out, this is not really about information flows. This is really the scope of this project. And every time we mention scope is to say, how would that message look like? What you're also looking at and you're interested in, and for the right reasons, is also the places where some of this information flows from or where it flows to. And at the moment, point of care testing and some of the other places you mentioned, contexts you mentioned, are out of scope. What it doesn't mean
out of scope.
They are out of scope, yes, because we have a whole bunch of point of care testing that actually PHE would love to include, not just in this, but also in SNOMED, which is actually missing in terms of coding. Does it make sense? So there are. I would probably say let's reflect on the fact that labs been sat there for a long time, and we need to address it. We cannot address it in one fell swoop, which means we have to say, if we now have a test result that needs to be sent across the wire, irrespective of context, let's first of all agree what would be in that message. And that's what the spec is really saying. Phil, in his other job, or in, when he's not busy doing this, is actually going around recording the information flows and the different places where information originates from. When that work is complete, that's when we will say, is this message spec as it currently stands fit for use or not fit for use? My gut would be that it would actually work because HL7 International have done some thinking, because the message itself wouldn't change. There might be things around it that might become more or less important. Does that make sense? And this probably also relates to the previous question you were saying, right? Every time we say out of scope, it doesn't mean that we are actually chopping off bits of what already exists in the standard. The standard as it stands can support them if they currently support it. So we're not preventing people from using them.
Yeah, it's Ian McNichol here. Just to add to that, because it may be helpful, we have an idea when we're doing this curation of saying, look, these are the curated data points within the resource or profile, and here are the things that we're leaving in, but we haven't curated. In other words, we're not, as Jay says, we're not chopping things out, but we're saying, look, we understand that other people, other wider groups may want to use this, and we're not stopping them use it. But what we have to do is curate this against some very specific known examples that we can get our head around, and then extend that scope of curation. So it's about it's about limiting the scope of the curation process and the thinking, rather than particularly locking down the models.
Yeah, and I think again, and I'm conscious because lots of people have actually joined this call, and they're probably thinking, well, we're not quite sure what it covers. It does. So FHIR, HL7 FHIR International Standard, if you look at it, one aspect of what they're now working on is the whole workflow process. Yes, they're actually starting to actually recognize that actually workflows are just as important as the message blocks themselves, and nothing that we're doing now prevents people from actually taking those aspects of workflows and incorporating them into their information flows if that's what they choose to do. We do not restrict them from doing it. All we're saying is, as an agreed specification, we haven't yet curated and agreed that this will work for across England for different case settings or different contexts.
So I think part of me feels, Jonathan, once we describe our design pattern in FHIR to you and give you a bit more detail, I think that will give you a bit more comfort that the design is very generic. The design pattern we are recommending is going to be very generic using FHIR, which should be able to meet most of the use cases, we believe. And maybe if we run through this call and come back to in 1 hour's time when we have gone through the design patterns, that will probably give you a bit more confidence that even though the scope we start with are quite constrained, but when we come to design, we are using very generic patterns.
Okay. Well, thanks. Particularly thanks to Jay and Ian for those comments. What I'm really saying is that the first slides in the slide pack and every briefing should describe that scope in the way that you've just done it, because it's very hard to understand that. I've actually asked this question explicitly. It's the first time I've had answers that look like that. With those, we can then go to bodies like Royal College of Pathologists and particularly system developers to make it really clear what the relationship is between the full functionality of HL7 FHIR and what this project does. Because without that, it's very hard for them to understand all those other flows that they have to manage, where they fit together. Because it's not this presentation isn't framed to describe what you've just told me verbally.
That's fine. That's useful feedback, Jonathan. And I think we'll amend the presentation beginnings. Definitely, the scope slides to capture the way I have described to you that we are handling it. And I think you're right. From the beginning, it sounds like we're doing very small bit, and people won't be able to work on the wider scope, which is not the case. Right. Any other questions? Okay, carry on.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So, so we're just seeing a generic process flow. Had with a discussion around that and the wider scope issues. So this is an example use case. It's not the only use case, obviously, that we're considering. But again, in the interest of time, we've included this particular one. So again, the sort of classic pathway of a test report that's been requested from primary care. So again, in interest of, there's only so much detail you can put on a single slide. It is a simplified use case description, but hopefully gives you a flavour and a bit more context in terms of the process. So appreciate there's a lot of detail in there, but I don't know if anybody's got any specific questions. If not, if we can move on to the next slide, Pete, please. So this is a patient journey or a scenario, so effectively an instance of the use case shown on the previous slide. So just provides a specific example of how that use case could work with an example test report. This particular one is a profile, so a set of observations, obviously values, units of measure, and reference ranges. And in this particular case, there's a comment relating to one of the observations at the bottom there. So again, just to provide additional context. So unless anybody's got any questions on that one, I think the next slide is a GP Connect use case.
Yeah, so this is just similar to Phil. We've just put the one use case in. There's obviously a lot of very similar use cases really for GP Connect, and it's all about the flow of data from the GP systems to a different care setting. In this case, we picked a LICRA in a hospital admission, so that if someone the hospital admission needs to see the pathology results, they'd be able to request them from GP Connect, and that could be the same. There's very similar use cases for different care settings, so community pharmacy or mental health, or there's lots of different use cases that are very similar. It's quite clear. Is there any questions?
Yeah, we got a question from John Williams.
Yes, could I ask, please? You've got the clinician request clinical summary from the LICA interface, and you've got the statement that the LICA determines what information it requires for the clinical summary. That all sounds very technical. I'm hoping that somewhere there's some human clinical input as to what actually will make up that summary. Where's that work being done to determine what will be in that summary and what won't?
I guess that would be done at the LICRA level. So, I mean, it's just an example of, in a local care record might include pathology results, and this would give it the option to do that. So how they define their local care record will all be their decision, and it just gives them another way of pulling data into that local care record.
So every LICA could have a different kind of summary? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. I mean, I guess the information that they get from GP Connect will always be consistent, but they could choose to display that in different ways.
Yeah, hi, Mike here, business analyst here. I mean, that's kind of the key point of GP Connect is we're not trying to design different local scenarios like what's needed by a pathologist when they do this, or by a emergency, so someone in an emergency center, compared to what needs to be seen by a cardiac care nurse, or what needs to be seen by a community pharmacist. They're going to vary. So our point is we're working not just in pathology but across the entire GP record and making it available in a way. What we're not trying to do is tell a local trust, this is what a summary should look like, this is what this should look like. What we're saying is that's the sort of stuff you understand based on your local needs and your local clinical understanding. And we're there to make sure once you know what you want that you can get that data.
So can I just follow up? I just want to ask, does that mean then that you would expect a LICA to tailor the summaries according to the use case? That's really what's behind my question.
I think that would be a discussion of the LICRA, because the LICRA might decide that actually all our conditions are very simple, and for practically safe, we're going to have a standard summary across our entire LICRA. Or the LICRA might decide, actually, because of the way that community uses it as compared to how hospital uses it, we're going to have multiple views. Or you could even get to really clever ones where a clinician could set their own summary, though that's getting into the more complicated scenarios. But the idea is we're not at the center, we're not trying to say what how a local area should look and view our data. We want to give them that capability to decide themselves based on their own clinical input.
So John, I think my understanding is what GP Connect is trying to do is expose the data in certain FHIR profiles. How they're joined up or bundled up or presented is a discussion, and I think it's a reasonable comment. There has to be, there can be kind of standardization there, but I think that's kind of out of scope for GP Connect. It's more to do with like a program when they do it regionally, whether they want to have a standard view per clinician or user type, or they want to have a summary view. But I think here the clinical summary is more of a exemplary, but I don't think it's up to GP Connect program to define what that is for a LICRA.
Would it be worth actually making a comment to that effect? Because if that had been in there, I might not have needed to raise this issue.
Yeah,
I think it's another one of these things of making it clear, you know, that you expect someone else to be doing that kind of work. It is out of scope for this project. I fully understand that. But otherwise, it leads to people to say, well, what summary is that? Is there a standard summary?
Yeah.
Is it the same as a summary care record? So if you had something that just explained everything that's just been said, it might be helpful.
Yeah, we'll do that. I think as a feedback, we need to get to the word clinical summary here, clinical request, GP record, so to speak. And I think because the clinical summary implies somebody summarizing it, and who is doing it. So I think we just need to be very clear that what's in scope and out of scope. Okay. Shall we move on? Okay, carry on.
Yep. So this slide is just really saying, looking at the logical model and saying which resources we're looking at using for each of the areas that we're going to curate. So obviously test report is going to be a diagnostic report. The model we're proposing, the test group header will be an observation, and each of the test results will be an observation. The specimen obviously will be in the specimen resource. Where we've got comments against the reports as they're filed, we said we'll capture them in an observation resource as well. And then the other part, which is perhaps a little different, is where we're sending a summary of the test request. We said we're going to send that in a procedure request. I guess that's probably slightly more contentious because the request may not have been sent in a procedure request, and it's probably worth remembering that. So we've used that to send those details. Any questions about that? No. So again, the next slide this is sort of detailing some of the reports, the resources that we use. You can see the different coloured boxes on the slide. The green boxes are resources that we've not been through curation at all before. So diagnostic report is actually included in that as well. So diagnostic report, procedure request, and specimen haven't previously been curated, so they'll be new to the curation process. The light blue boxes in the left-hand corner, patient, practitioner, organisation, practitioner, condition, they've all previously been curated. We're proposing to use them as is. I don't think there's any change in how we're using them. All the other boxes are actually about observations, which has been through curation as a resource, but I suppose the use cases are slightly different than what the observation's been used for previously, and probably a bit more detailed. So we're looking at those again too. So you can see there that we're using observation for a number of different things. The orange box is for filing comments that we talked about previously. The blue boxes are for the individual results, and you can see that there may be referenced from the diagnostic report or as part of a battery or a test group. And so the purple box there is the test group header, which is also going to be an observation. There's quite a lot on that slide. Any questions about it? It just is almost just a different way of reflecting the previous version. No. I think at this point, there's probably worth pointing out that the ways of dealing with test groups, there are a number of different ways. So the part on the right-hand side, there's a number of different options for how you can deal with that, and FHIR suggests 3 options, which is diagnostic report and result, observation and observation component, and observation with related observations. So we're just going to talk through each of those options quickly. So the first option with the diagnostic report as the group header and the individual observations as results. So linked directly to the diagnostic report. And you can see the just snippets of the FHIR profile that I've added in for the fields that we'll be using for that. Obviously, you know, in this arrangement, in the group header, you'd have your full blood count, and then in each of the results, you'd have things, the individual elements such as white blood cell count, hemoglobin, etc. Obviously, if you were going to do it that way, some reports at the moment send multiple test groups, so you'd end up having multiple diagnostic reports. You know, that could create a bit of clutter, really. Any questions about that? Shall I carry on?
So Pete, do you want to open the diagnostic report resource and just show people the option 1 how it will look in the resource
So using this method, the diagnostic report would contain the code, which would be the full blood count or the battery header, and then each of the results would be linked through the results, references to observations, and the specimens would be linked by the specimen resource. So I think that's fairly clear. So I'll talk through the next one.
I got a question here from Damien.
Yeah, it's David Murphy. Just from a forward compatibility perspective, FHIR R4 doesn't have procedure request anymore. It seems to have been replaced by a more generic service request.
Yes, I appreciate that, and I think that we need somewhere to put the details related to the test request, and I don't know how else you would do it. You could do it as an extension, but we thought it would be better to use something that was standard. We realise that the service request is coming in the next version, and if we can make it so it would be compatible with that, we definitely will.
Yeah, it is very clearly a request, and it's a reference to that request. It was purely a matter of forward compatibility, given that we already know that procedure request as such is on its way out.
Yeah, we have looked at the service request, and hopefully we'll try and do it in such a way that we don't use fields that aren't in the service request.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got another question which says, does the message have the ability to include measurement of uncertainty for the various observations?
Well, I kind of jumping the gun a little bit because that's one of our extensions, I suppose. In FHIR, the comparators don't include an approximate sign, which would, I suppose, be used to denote uncertainty. So we're proposing extending for that. Is that kind of?
Yeah, that's fine. We'll come back to it because it's in the pack anyway. It's coming later, so that's fine. Okay, I got Jay.
Oh, sorry. Just a quick note on that. You know, test results and FHIR 4.0. I think the broad design principle also would be worth documenting, and this is just for the internal team to actually say, here's how we are actually going to maintain forward compatibility with 4.0 as a principle, and also broadly to say test request is something which is a stub at the moment, but the next iteration of the pathology work will specifically look at it. So for example, if you look at what genomics is actually really trying to do, it is a lot about test requests than test results at the moment. So again, part of the incremental scope or the approach that we're taking is when we get to that point, we would say, and this is how this will get fleshed out and it'll get curated. Just so I think for the internal team, it would be worth actually documenting some of it just based on previous comments as to how we intend this to be rolled out and used by system developers.
Yeah, so I think we have looked at R for where possible and tried to make it future-proof. But I think the point, that's a good principle, and Jay, we're going to capture it as a general design principle for curation moving forward. But I think the point Damien raised is really helpful because I think we do need to look into it from as a core team perspective. Okay. Okay. Do you want to move to option 2? Okay.
Yeah. So option 2 was using an observation code to hold the battery or test group header and individual observation components. So just quickly look at the observation resource. So this would be using the code to hold the battery header and then the component code and value to hold the individual results. So obviously we've considered that as well, but we think that components, according to the FHIR spec also, they say they should be used for measurements that have been taken at the same time by the same device. I mean, obviously blood pressure is one that fits that very clearly, but it's not necessarily going to be true for all the different results that we're going to want to send. Also, the nested structure might make it more difficult to query, and it may make it might restrict the ability to search against particular results. Any questions about option 2? No. Keep going. So option 3 is our recommended option. And this is where it's worth pointing out as well, all these would be contained within a diagnostic report with the other resources as stated on the kind of earlier slide. But yeah, this is with an observation, separate observation to hold the test group header information. Again, we'd use look at the observation resource up. So again, we'd use the code to hold the observation resource. It's probably worth pointing out, I think Chris from TPP asked or Will asked about the value. Obviously, it's an optional element, so you wouldn't expect a value at the header level necessarily. And then we'd use the related element to relate other observations that contain the results. So you end up with a sort of nested observation structure. And the reason we're recommending that is because it's a very flexible structure and it will allow for different patterns. And so far, I don't think we've found any patterns that it wouldn't support. Although obviously, part of the reason for this call is if you think there are patterns that wouldn't fit this model, then if you could raise them to us, it'd be really helpful. But hopefully, it will provide a single, consistent way of modelling. See, Damien's got his hand up.
May I make a suggestion rather than using an extension for the error bars to have a related observation with a range in it? So you have a focus observation with your actual stated value, and then a related observation with a range in it with the uncertainty. Just a thought.
I'm not quite sure what you mean. Sorry.
Well, rather than introducing an extension to observation to carry the uncertainty in a measurement, so you've got a measurement plus a set of error bars, to have a related observation that carries the uncertainty. So you would have a value and say a quantity in the value with with its units, and then another observation in the bundle referenced via the related attribute that carried the uncertainty.
So like a qualified by related observation.
Qualified by, yes, yeah.
And that's an interesting idea, and we can definitely look at that.
Just a thought.
Yeah, and I guess it would give you more flexibility because it wouldn't necessarily be tied down to one concept.
I'm just slightly nervous about extensions, particularly given that much of the industry interest in this is international, and for the scope for exercises similar to this one in other countries coming to slightly different conclusions, and the closer we can get to generic FHIR for this, as documented in the FHIR resource list, the less itchy I get about it. But maybe that's just me.
I think that's another thing. As a design principle, we avoid extensions as well as much as possible. So I think that's a very good suggestion. I think we'll definitely look into it and see if we can, need to have an extension if we don't need. Mike, Stacey, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just to clarify, when we talk about uncertainties, could you give sort of an example? Is it like a 12 plus or minus 2 or something like that? Or have I misunderstood you? Coming from a non-pathology background. Hello?
Hang on a minute. Pete is on mute. Pete, do you want to come in? Oh, you're on mute again.
I'm going to jump in there. So
Go ahead, Pete.
I guess the thing we were looking to model was approximate, because we know that there was a.
Yeah, that's kind of why I wanted to clarify, because I'm wondering whether what we've done previously is very different from what's being asked about. So is this about things like standard deviations and other variations where you have actually a measured uncertain level of uncertainty, as opposed to, I think, what we did, at least when I was involved about a couple of weeks ago, where we just had an approximate, which is just a general level, which just says approximate, it doesn't say.
Yeah, I was just going to ask who asked the question in the chat initially. Do they want to come in and qualify exactly what they meant?
So it was George Phillip. George, do you want to come in?
Yeah, hi everybody. Yeah, just uncertainty. It's a requirement in certain territories that for each observation that the laboratory report, that they specify what their measurement of uncertainty is. And it's it's certainly coming into vogue. So I was just wondering what scope we had in the message to report that as and when that becomes mandated.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think at this point we haven't covered that, so it sounds to me like that might be a new thing that we need to just get a bit more information about. And
Hi,
so
Steve,
George,
can I just come back in? Obviously, Damien makes a really good point that we shouldn't be adding extensions, willy-nilly. However, handling it as a sub-observation, in a sense, you just get into the same problem unless you can assume that everyone else internationally is doing the same thing. So, whilst it would be, it's going to be technically not an extension in terms of what recipients or producers are expecting to do with something like uncertainty, a new data point. It moves the story around a little bit. I don't think it solves it. So I think ultimately this is about taking. Observation is a perfectly reasonable approach, probably the best one, but we also need to take those ideas back and discuss them with international colleagues, because presumably other people are having the same problems, and the danger is that they'll be solving them in their own ways, which may not line up with ours.
yeah, I must say I'd be very nervous about moving uncertainty into a separate entity or FHIR profile, because uncertainty is part of the whole result. So effectively, you're now putting the result across multiple single result across multiple FHIR profiles. So there's a risk that people will see the first profile and not realize there's an uncertainty attached to it.
again, from a forward compatibility perspective, though, I'm fairly sure observation has a rather large and prominent N beside it in 4. Yeah, it does. So it's but by FHIR release 4, it's regarded as normative. So it's very important to have those discussions. That observation doesn't actually carry uncertainty, maybe a failing in observation, but will possibly not have the opportunity to go back and revisit that at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, I guess our decision to sort of consider an extension for approximate actually did come from recommendations on Zulip, which is the FHIR website. So, you know, we were taking advice from the international community, I suppose. But I think that it's definitely an interesting point and one that we'll definitely look into.
Okay. Jade, did you have a comment?
No, I was just going to say we should probably consult the international community, and there will always be things that we need to extend. I mean, version 4.0 is normative, but hey, before we know, 4.0.1 will be out, and there will be something in it, just like we found out about fasting status, right? So I think Ian's suggestion to take it to international committee is the right thing to do. We should probably take it through multiple channels, is what I'd say.
Yeah. Okay, we'll do that. I think Dave Henderson from our team, can you post that in Zulip and get some feedback? And we'll kind of include that in our discussions.
Yep, I can do that.
Okay, you want to move on, Pete, to the next section?
Yeah, I suppose this is sort of acknowledging that although there's a desire to move to more structured messaging for certain areas, a lot of the results at the moment coming from labs are still text, and it's just sort of saying how we're going to deal with that. And I suppose the proposition at the moment is to deal with the text result in an observation that we would use for a result using the value string, again, much like GP to GP handles it in the HL7 version 3 message. And again, we use that pattern for things like microbiology, which also has text-based results at the moment. Questions about that?
Jonathan?
You call that text-based, but that's actually categorical. That one isn't text-based.
Yeah.
Sorry, what do you mean?
Text. One of the examples John mentioned in his river message, where it's just nicely formatted, but it's a chunk of text.
Ah, okay. I wonder if that's a great example for what you're trying to say here, because it gets into the issue of tables, which rely on alignment. We've had problems with proportional fonts. That example there, you're saying is only text but looks like a table.
Yeah, and it is something John Williams raised on River. John, do you want to talk about that?
Yes, I mean, Jonathan, I think it might be a mini light bulb moment perhaps, but in GP to GP we came across this, and it frequently went wrong when we were taking on new suppliers. We had to be really careful about text, because there are all sorts of things. You've mentioned formatting changes. There's how white space gets handled, and if you're not careful, things get stripped out, and then you end up with the columns being misaligned and giving you exactly the wrong result to a human reader. So this is a really important point, that if we have got text that's structured in this way, there needs to be great care taken to make sure that that structure is maintained across every transition.
Do you have any further questions about that?
Jonathan, your hand is still up. Did you have further comments?
No, I just haven't got the hang of the technology.
Okay, that's fine. Carry on.
Again, we've talked about filing comments, and we said we'd handle them in observations, again, to avoid any extensions and those sorts of things. And this is just a bit of where they would fit. We'd say at the moment, comments that are at the report level, we would reference from the result. And I think the thing that we need to confirm really is we need a terminology that we could put in the code to indicate that they're filing comments. So we'd need probably a SNOMED code to signify that, which we're looking into. We haven't got a code that we're going to use yet, but I think Andrew will probably look at that in due course. And in each of the other levels, so the test group level and the test level, we'll handle comments in the related observations with using the qualified by option in the type. Have any questions about that?
No, I think we got no questions, but I think this is another good example where we have avoided any kind of extension by for filing comments using another instance of observation resource to capture those.
Just one comment from me, Yassine. I mean, we're aware that some of the GP systems actually have quite sophisticated, filing parts of the record that, lots of tick boxes and check boxes to support workflow and pre-cooked messages. Our decision here was not to try to replicate that or standardize it. This is just a way of capturing pretty well some kind of, textual representation in quite a simple way. I think we recognize that actually doing that standardization might be very valuable in terms of, distributed workflow for the future, but it would require going down a whole different field of activity at the moment.
Mm-hmm. The next thing we were going to ask about really is specimen type. So we weren't really sure how much it was used within. In EDIFACT, it's a text field, and I suppose we were discussing the value of it and what sort of a value set we should be looking for it. So we're really after some input from suppliers as to, at the moment, does it get used, and are there particular use cases for having this structured encoded, or is it something that people think is less useful?
So Pete, do you want to load up the specimen resource and show where the type is?
Yeah. So in specimen we have type, which is a codable concept, kind of material that forms a specimen.
So do you want to open up this list? So I think what we're discussing as core team is either the number of options, either we can give a SNOMED value set for it, or people could use the example value set, which is FHIR, or they can just use the text. But the question is, what is the significance of this in terms of current use? And how if people will use it for any kind of querying, what is the current use case for having this field? Any input from suppliers would be really helpful. So any lab system suppliers are here, is Clinisys here? Lee Webb from Clinisys, do you have any view?
I do, yeah. No, I think it is important for us to capture that separately within the LIMS, and therefore to be able to send it out to downstream systems. There are some tests that can be performed on multiple specimen types, and the interpretation may be different depending on what specimen type it is. I'm thinking particularly some of the virology molecular tests. There are different specimen types and different container types that you might receive. So that personally, I think it's important, and I'd be quite happy to just stick with the SNOMED CT definition of specimen types.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Munish, sorry, this is Laszlo. Sorry, I can't put up my hand. That's the reason. But I think it's important from the pathologist point of view as well, is to know, because several sort of things are done on certain type of specimens, and it could be used for demand management and lots of other things as well. Thank you.
Yeah, echo that. Thanks, Laszlo.
Okay, that seems to be coming towards SNOMED CT. If we use SNOMED CT, any suppliers, would they have any major issues with it? If you have...
So, could I just make a comment? Just from experience of seeing how this is used in V2 messages in particular, I'm conscious that it's clearly an important bit of information, but there's a lot of things that I've seen that don't lend themselves to a simple SNOMED code. They maybe actually carry a mix of ideas, the type certainly, the method, sometimes even the style of container, saturated blood or whatever. That's my concern, that if we try to restrict this to SNOMED coding, we're going to make it very difficult for legacy messages in particular to operate. Somebody's going to have to untangle that.
Okay. Thanks, Ian. Fred? Fred, we can't hear you. Are you muted?
Sorry, I had double muted myself on the microphone as well. Just to add to the previous speaker, I think beyond the blood type or the anticoagulant in the tube, I would almost like to see the size of the tube referred to as well, because more and more we have labs that try to interface order entry directly with transport systems, and the decision to route something one way or another is quite often linked to the physical type of tube as much as the contents of the tube.
So just to go back to what I was trying to say, look, there are many things we could standardize, and actually the specimen model does support a lot of these, including specimen quantity, and there's a separate place for additive, there's a separate place for you name it. There's lots of different so we could go back to the lab community and say, look, there's sufficient demand that we should try and tidy this up, as Ferris just said. The problem is that's not where we are now. That would need a lot of coordination between all the different labs to agree on those standards. It would mean quite a lot of reworking of current messaging, as I understand it. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I've had a negative experience. But my understanding from seeing a number of V2 messages is that people are just lobbing a lot of these different concepts into type, and it may not be high value at the moment to try to sort that out.
Okay, Andrew Perry. Andrew Perry, do you want to come in?
I was going to say, but probably the same thing as Ian, is that this specimen type is one single attribute of the specimen resource in FHIR, and and from a point of view of kind of future proofing us, we should stick to the proper use of this attribute, and kind of where people are talking about additives and container sizes, those can be represented in this resource, but they shouldn't, we definitely shouldn't conflate them into this attribute. And just in terms of the SNOMED binding on that's the so that there is a SNOMED on FHIR group that's kind of run curated through SNOMED, but has a lot of 807 contributions, and that is the terminology binding that has been suggested for this. The one on the previous slide was the terminology binding that has been suggested by the SNOMED on FHIR group. There are there some other one of the things they suggested is that specimen type possibly isn't the most accurate name for the attribute, but kind of that might get pushed back to FHIR. There's a two-way flow of kind of information between the SNOMED on FHIR group and the FHIR technical authors.
Jay, do you want to come in?
Hey, Manish. So I think I wrote down what I was going to say on comments as well. I think it's really nice to be on these calls where people actually make case for having something in, but also other people make the case for not having something in. I would broadly say there are two other...
Oh, yeah. That frozen section you already for that's come. The lower bound
Hello.
Carry on, Jay. Hey.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Jonathan, can you hear me?
Yeah. I can hear you, Jay. Carry on.
Yes, I was just leaving my thoughts on the comment section where I was saying, in fact, that it's great to be on these calls where I see people making cases for why something should be done, but other people say, well, here's why we don't want to do this. Broadly, I think this is the problem we have in the pathology program where we have different iterations for looking at different areas of work. This conversation to me feels to be in two specific areas. Test request side of it and specimen tracking, because if you want to do specimen details and other things, there's definitely a need, and we all know just because HL7B2 doesn't do it or somebody doesn't do it, it still happens at the moment, right? So we are not yet there to address it. So I would say as a program, we put these comments and requests as a backlog, and we get around to the iterating into, let's look at specimen requests, sample tracking, that's when we pick these up. So for now, the broad comment I would say is stick to what FHIR does it. Let's not debate whether it should be SNOMED or not. If FHIR allows the specimen and the container types to be represented, anybody who wants to use them now can use them.
Okay, so I think there's a proposal from Ben to use what FHIR has got with V2 mappings and make it extensible. I personally think that's quite a reasonable proposal, because then it allows people to put other things if they want to.
I'd agree with that, Manish, although just recognise, that's going to mean a bit of a muddle for a while. But we're in a bit of a muddle now, so we're not any worse off.
Yeah, so I think that covers kind of the current scenario and your concerns here, and that people won't be able to use other stuff. And also we can build on as we kind of go through iterations of these to see how we develop this.
Can I just jump in, Muni? Sorry, I know I'm interrupting. But David Korn's question is a beautiful question. I was hoping somebody else would raise it. This is the tricky part. This, in some ways, is a tricky part where I think the boundary between what is in SNOMED within the code to what is outside gets a bit blurred. It would be worth parking for now. I don't think we need to discuss unless, David, you can't hold yourself back and you want to explain what you're saying. I think that's the beautiful part where I think what goes in the FHIR message or an attribute in the FHIR message might also get duplicated in the code itself. Just flagging it up because that's a beautiful comment as far as I'm concerned.
So just to read David Korn's comment to everybody, am I right in thinking that the UTC codes included representation of the type of specimen test was done on? I personally don't understand this.
I can give an example on that one. So part of the UTC as in UTL is what we call Unified Test List, is a SNOMED subset of codes we are building that gets sent across the wire or actually gets included as part of the result. At the moment, if you look at the modeling of UTL, one of the aspects of what is modeled within that code of UTL is the specimen type on which it was actually done, which is really, really simple for things like serum plasma. Although I realize specimen type can be a lot bigger than that. So what David is saying is, hey guys, actually for a whole bunch of things, we don't need to specifically tell people about the specimen and the container maybe, because some of this might be also inferable from the code. I said might because you might still care about the fact that they were in the same specimen was sent but used in, two different preservatives, for example, right? So this is, I think, the beautiful boundary where how much of information that is currently of need is within a code based off the specimen, and how much of it is in the FHIR model. Did that make sense to people who are listening?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I understand it better. Thanks. So basically, we're saying the SNOMED code itself, the test code itself, might have some information on specimen type. And then again, this is a philosophical debate on how much of information model you carry in FHIR, how much you carry in SNOMED. Right. Okay. So I think currently we will stick to the proposal which Ben has given and make it extensible, unless anybody's got issues with the proposal.
So from the work that there was extensive discussion, kind of 2 2-hour sessions at SNOMED on FHIR around the terminology binding and the model of specimen, and most there's quite a mix of things in this list here. So there's aspirate, which is actually a method rather than a substance, and the conclusion in the SNOMED on FHIR discussions was that the specimen hierarchy, which actually isn't part of substance or body size, wasn't appropriate and what wasn't decently mapped. So and so I have reservations about using this list. It was looked at by by terminologists kind of looking in this area and kind of I would hesitate to sort of back this proposal without looking at it in more detail, and we can try and I'll distribute the link to the SNOMED on FHIR site. It's partially closed because it's part of the members forum, but people can go on that. I think we need to come back to this.
Okay, we'll look into it. If we can put the link on the Rival platform and get some feedback. Well, I think we've got a number of options now, including the link you're going to send and Ben's proposal as well. So, okay. Any other comments? Okay, carry on.
So then we have in this iteration suggested a couple of extensions. So obviously the extension for approximately, which we talked about with Damien's suggestion of maybe using an observation resource rather than an extension, which we will have a look at. And obviously Ian's comment about you kind of just moving the problem around is also true, but certainly something we can look at in more detail. The other extension that we were going to look at was one for fasting status, which is extending to include a field that will be available in version 4. So this is release 4 version of FHIR specimen, and you can see here there's a fasting status that didn't really exist previously, and it was something that we thought we needed to represent anyway. So at the moment, they're the only 2 extensions that we've considered. Are there any questions about those? Let me see, we've discussed one of them.
So I think, do you want to show the fasting status in release 4?
Yeah, that's what I just did. There we go.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So that's the one we are proposing as extension in STU3 for a forward compatibility. Okay. We got Jonathan.
Yeah, just a note there that similar to that discussion about how much is done in SNOMED CT, how much is done in FHIR on identifying investigations. There's a similar issue for fasting status, because I'm not sure how that's been approached in the new list of investigations in SNOMED CT. I.e., is fasting blood glucose the name of an investigation or not?
Okay, Jay.
Okay, quick comment on that. I think it's the ability to be able to do something different with it. We are aware that there are fasting, tests of some sort of various sorts in SNOMED CT. We have debated as to where the precondition, this is what we call a precondition, just for the record. So the fact that the patient is fasting is only a precondition. We don't believe it should necessarily change the meaning of a code, although it would change the interpretation of a code. And so by extension, we don't believe at the moment that it should be part of a code or a specific code. I'm really conscious at the moment. I am making a controversial statement because there are a whole bunch of fasting codes that exist at the moment. So let us actually park this for now as one of those tricky problems between terminology models and information models. We know historically people have preferred to solve it the simpler way by sticking it into the terminology, right? And I think this would be the sort of question I would love to take to the international lab medicine community. Say, guys, we now have two ways of doing it. Which one do you think works better? Does that answer some of your question, Jonathan? But then we have a problem.
I like not having it in the name of the investigation, but it's by far the majority practice is to have it in, as in fasting blood glucose.
Agree. So that was a problem for a different time. Future systems shouldn't necessarily want to do it. If we choose not to do it when we have a slightly different problem, which is what do we do with all the historical data? And that's why I would love to take this to the April SNOMED discussion and say, guys, we need to solve this properly.
Can I add one thing very quickly?
Go ahead, Laszlo.
Sorry, I don't have the ability to put up my hand. I'm on my phone. I think it's yes. Jay is entirely right. We need to park it for a later sort of discussion. But I think this needs to be handled slightly differently because I still believe that the clinicians should request things very simply, like I want to have a fasting glucose period, but it shouldn't be part of the sort of test name or the test itself. I think it should be a separate condition, and that needs to be somehow sort of traversed, but it's probably not for now to discuss.
Ben?
Hi. I was just going to say, and I understand the risk of if you put it into the requests in the terminology is as well as having it passed out in the information model somewhere else. The risk is that the two could be inconsistent. So in terms of having a choice of having one or the other, there could be inconsistencies in the knowing where to look. I think one thing that could be explored would be to allow the values to be loaded in the request and the terminology, but also require them to be passed out into the information model, so that you'd have that so you'd be able to rely on looking at within the specimen type, for example. But then you'd probably want to look at having possibly looking at using FHIR paths to have invariant rules in the element definition, saying well, if the request is of this type, then you would expect the specimen type to be one of these values or to be this value, or just an idea about something that could be explored more. Hello?
Yeah,
Ben, I think that's a great solution.
Yeah, I think we'll take that on board, Ben. We'll discuss it internally, how to handle it. But as Jay said, it's going to evolve in terms of as we kind of go through iterations. Any other comment on this? Ben, your hand is still up. Did you have any? Okay, thank you. Okay, Pete, do you want to move on?
Yeah, well, I think it's Phil has some assumptions that we've made, some questions about them. Are you going to?
Yeah. Thanks, Pete.
Do these? Cheers, Phil.
So the first one is around payment details. So there's a segment in the EDIFAT spec, laboratory service order, segment 4, I think it is, that carries a payment category field. It's also labeled as financial charges allocation. And based on some data analysis we've done, that particular data item doesn't seem to be populated. So I guess the question for the group is, is it used? And presumably if so, we will need to carry that forward into FHIR. But it's really to get a wider set of views, really. I don't know if you've got the EDIFAT spec to hand, Pete.
Just get it up now.
So I think the question for suppliers is there any use case for this? Is it really used? Do we need to worry about it? Or we can just drop it because legacy thing and it's not used. Jonathan?
I didn't want it in the national message, and Department of Health insisted on it being there. I don't think it's widely used, but there is a related point that is not the extension, and that is the origin of the report is more complex, I think, than is being considered at the moment. And that particularly relates to reorganisation of laboratories, work between them, the joint venture operations in London. So I wouldn't have it here, but I think there's something about where this report came from that's going to be quite important in the future.
Okay, thank you. If anybody else has got any views on it.
No, I don't think so. Unless anybody else raises their hand, I think we're gonna not include it. If you do want it to be included, you can come in now. Okay, move on.
Okay, so the last bullet point in there relates to the ability to batch test results. So our understanding is this is legacy behaviour related to when the EDIFACT messages first went in, obviously back in the days of dial-up and the need to save costs. So our understanding is that it has an ability to group together a set of test results for different patients that can be sent as a batch. And again, our understanding is that that was used to send groups of tests, say, when the telephone calls charges were cheapest. I suppose the question is, moving into the world of FHIR, is that behaviour really required? And our assumption, our understanding currently is no, but again, I'll put that to the group.
I don't see a particular value in this within the scope we're discussing. In areas like immunisation screening programs, it's the standard way of doing it.
Okay.
So you're saying this should be included?
Within this scope, I don't think that has particular value. But if, for example, you're a microbiology report sending out vaccination reports, by far the most efficient way is to have them all saying, here's a set of vaccination reports, name, date, value. Yeah, so you shape it differently. But I don't see a big need for it in what we're discussing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Damien?
Why technically it's an issue in terms of carrying the information in FHIR structures, and if it's convenient, then I don't see it's a particular problem, because within the information carried about any given patient, then all the references would point to the various resource instances for that patient, and if there were other things there that belong to other patients, then it wouldn't be a problem.
Okay. So I don't know if anybody else got any comments on those, but if not.
Okay.
Thanks. Just reflecting on Jonathan's comment, I think I'm just wearing my, between lost in translation hat on at the moment. So I think Jonathan's comment was the scope of this project doesn't make sense. For maybe even for microbiology itself might not make sense, but if we then combine microbiology with immunization, maybe it does make sense to have, or at least start thinking of this. I'm aware some of the previous work did cover immunizations. I just wonder if this is one of those things that falls through a gap, and I'm just flagging that as a possible risk. I don't know where that would go at the moment. It certainly wouldn't go in the pathology program. It probably, I don't know if there's a generic risk register, but just seems like something worth capturing.
I think at the moment the best thing would be, Jay, for you to capture that as a risk for in your program and then hand over whoever wants it.
Okay, cool. That's a good solution. Thanks. Okay, Phil, I will just leave that with you for now, and we can pick this up again. Cheers.
Yeah, will do, Jay.
Okay, Andrew, attack.
Hello.
Hi.
Where you're saying about keeping it to one patient per message, we can send out over 5,000 GP results a day sometimes, and we often have batches of 50 patients go out in one message to a GP practice.
Okay. Which means you're saying you do need the batching functionality.
It actually makes it easier, because if there's problems and you're trying to trace what's happened to messages, if you've got batches of them, it's far easier to trace a whole lot than it is to try. If you're tracking down individual patients, there could be so many messages that you're looking for.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
and especially when you're going on to things like moles to see what's going on.
Okay, Jay.
Hey guys, so sorry, I keep wincing every time I hear these comments, just because something needs to be done for a real life situation where you do need to batch. I don't think we're actually, arguing against the ability or the need for having batching. I think that's fine, but to include it as part of a specification sounds really horrible to me as an engineering principle. So I would be really against it. What I would love to say is, if you're using a middleware, and I know I'm sorry, Andrew, I know you will kind of probably smile at me or kind of curse me, but if you are using a solution, a middleware solution, you probably want to investigate how your middleware solution can handle those batching, as instead of actually sticking it into the standard spec. Shoot me now if you disagree, by the way. I won't take it the wrong way.
Well, I was just looking at batching in terms of we're sending stuff out to over 180 different GP practices, and I get quite a few queries every week from practices saying, "Oh, we haven't got this," or "We haven't got that," and it's generally a problem with their system supplier. Well, with their system, and they have to get onto their supplier about it. But the ability to easily track the messages makes life so much easier when you're trying to do this fault finding and see where the fault is. Now, whether it's with our end or whether it's with their end, or quite what it is.
Okay, so I got a few people coming in. Damien, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, it's also not actually necessarily a problem that the pathology curation needs to consider itself as solving, because the NHS Digital Fire Policy Working Group has a paper that I wrote along with, what's her name? Katie Wheatley, about precisely this, about the distinction between various forms of collective submissions of FHIR resource sets, including batches and including transactional sets, which had to be handled atomically. So there is consideration of how to do that anyway available from other sources that that could just be used in this case, rather than being something for pathology itself to have to solve.
Yeah, I agree. I think this brings on James' point that this is sending pattern, and hard coding this in profiles is not the best idea. We have to look at a generic approach of doing it, and pathology can use it. And as you said, that's being considered. And as a design principle, it doesn't seems like a good idea for us to hard code any kind of that requirement into any of the profiles. So, from a curation perspective, I think we should keep it kind of decoupled and have that conversation how to handle that batching for FHIR in a generic way. Mike.
Okay, might be covered for what's just said, but I think the key thing here is we're not saying you can't batch these and send multiple FHIR messages for multiple patients at the same time under the same wrapper, for instance. All we're saying here is that in terms of what we're defining for a pathology message, it's a single self-contained message for one patient. But that you could send multiple under the same wrapper system, depending on the various technologies available. I don't think it prevents any of that.
Oh, right, that's no problem then. That was my biggest concern. I thought they were saying we couldn't do that. But yeah, if we can send individual messages under one wrapper, then that's fine.
Okay, Ian.
Yeah, I guess the principle is, look, we're definitely not saying don't do it. We're not looking at it particularly. We're not trying to solve that problem. And what would be really helpful is those of you who expect to do that, have a look at what we're doing and tell us if there are any gotchas. We don't think there are, but that feedback at this point would be really, really helpful.
Okay, Jonathan.
Yep, I think it's the same point as Mike's. We're talking about two different things under batching. One was that efficiency about the messages and how much you can put in. But the specific issue that I think is on the slide was the one I was referring to, which is to say, here come a whole lot of neonatal phenylketonuria results. Patient X negative, patient Y negative, patient Z negative, rather than the normal shape for a report, which goes patient and then investigations under that in the hierarchy. And it's that bit that I don't think is needed at the moment, not the efficiency argument.
Okay. I think we will, based on the feedback, I think we will carry on our conversation with Damien on the guidance of what the request is coming from Andrew, and I think for the other layer of it in terms of immunizations and all that batching, I think as Jay's discussed, we have to look into future requirements. Right. Okay. Does that finish the batching discussion? I think. The summary. Go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, just to summarise then, we're still working through it, and we're hoping to publish the alpha spec in March, and there'll be a link on the C3 thread in Riva. Obviously, we're interested to hear from suppliers and that will be interested in being involved in first of types, and I guess there's, we've gone through a fair amount of detail there. If after the call you remember something you want to let us know about, obviously use Riva to get back to us with further comments. So I think that's
so I think the principle is that this call is set up to really introduce the pathology discussion and also give you high-level design options and some of the discussions we had. And you are welcome or encouraged to go to the Riva platform, and if you think about after this call that you have further questions or comments, carry on the conversation there, and we as core team will pick it up. At this point, does anybody else have got any other question? Jonathan, are you feeling a little bit better about the scope now?
Thanks for the question. I need to think about it, but the thing that would help me most is what we discussed, which is that very early discussion where I kept interrupting. If those framed this discussion in the slides in the documents, it would make it much easier to understand who's doing what. My concern then is not predominantly about what you're describing within this project, but that those wider needs are not being addressed anywhere.
Okay. Jay?
Just a quick comeback to Jonathan. So Jonathan, you will have enough and more time to ask me all these questions during the informatics review that PRSP is holding.
Okay.
I'm sorry, again, please?
So I'm saying you will have enough and more opportunities to ask all these questions, the broader informatics questions, as part of the PRSP informatics review, and I will attend those calls. But I think what I really appreciated is your feedback as to say the message has to be much better coordinated and put out cleanly.
Thanks, Jay.
Okay, Ian?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question back, actually. It was particularly about micro, obviously not within the scope. Since we've got a lot of knowledgeable people on here, at some point we are going to have to tackle microbiology. There are definitely aspects of that deserve to be coded and structured in a consistent way. I just wanted to see if it's, if there's any quick views on whether the micro lab community are really in a mood for undertaking that level of standardization, because it will have to come from within the community. My feeling is we're just not there at the moment.
Okay, I'll let people think about it. I got a hand up from TPP. Do you want to come in? I'm not sure it's a different topic.
Just around some of the mandatory fields in the specification, I think we've got to be very careful about stuff like your fasting states and stuff. Legacy data. We've talked a lot here about this comes from lab and goes through. There's lots of legacy data out there, where from be it previous migrations, be it manually added results, where you're not necessarily going to have specimens. You've literally just got a group of results. So I think we're just going to be very careful that we're not making fields mandatory where it literally does not exist in legacy data.
Yeah, I think that's the design principle we have anyway. We don't think mandate unless they're mandated in FHIR in the base resources. And yeah, we are likely to mandate things as we move forward unless there is a real clear business need or a clinical safety issue.
Yeah, Manish, and we do need feedback from people on the ground who understand the realities of what's there, so that if we are faced with something that is mandatory in the underlying FHIR resource, and that is going to cause the sort of difficulty that's been expressed, then it's up to us to provide some clear guidance, consistent guidance that gets us around that. But we need to have good examples. I think that's the biggest thing we can get at the moment, is to understand where the real world problems are likely to come in.
Yeah. So I think from our perspective, it will be helpful, Will and Chris, if you got any specific examples, if you find where you think mandation won't work, or you're welcome to look at our design decision matrix and have a view and give us some feedback.
Yeah, I've given some feedback already.
Okay, that's great. Ben?
Hi. There was just a couple of other points. I've added a couple of points to the chat channel. One was just about ensuring, in terms of creating extensions for things that exist in R4, such as fasting state. We should look at creating standard backports similar to what was discussed with the proposed medication request status reason extension. I've just added a link to the Zulip channel about that. And the other point was just around the observation grouping that was discussed in terms of the different options. I don't see those as necessarily having to be mutually exclusive approaches. It depends on, so some things are going to be grouped at the diagnostic report level. Some things that may be appropriate to group at the component level, where it wouldn't make sense for the observation to be looked at in isolation, and other things may be appropriate to group by related observations. And just put a link in there to the guidance on the observation results about the distinction between those. And then the final point was just about the point being made about the observation profile having gone through curation. While there was a very limited scope in terms of the generic observation was really just looked at in terms of vital signs, and it's only so far been through clinical curation, but there's been 2 stages to the curation so far in terms of clinical and then a technical review, and it hasn't been through the technical review yet. That was all.
Yeah. Well, we're aware of that, and I think we said we had to create an instance of Care Connect observations for doing vitals because we couldn't create a vitals or news to level 3 without having a level 2 instance. But as the approach, as Ian described, is that the way we handle these things is that we only curate for things where we have use case, and for the rest of the profile, we don't delete anything, we leave it there, and we curate as we go along.
No, that all makes sense. It was just to clarify for others on the call that when we say that something's been through curation, it's been through a round of clinical review, but there was also a second round in terms of a technical review, which some of the profiles have been through, which the observation hasn't been through yet.
No, it hasn't gone through formal technical review. So, Ben, the other points you made in terms of observations, pattern and design pattern we are proposing, I think we have looked into the observation guidance in quite a detail. And again, the pattern we're recommending, we think is 80-20. It will meet most scenarios. In terms of the component pattern, we felt the guidance is so tight on component pattern for having same instrument, same practitioner, same time, that in pathology results we couldn't find any use cases for it. Though blood pressure is more of a vital, not a pathology result. And I think if you do have use cases in which you think we will use alternative, the other patterns, please kind of, if you send us some use cases, it will be really helpful for us to look into it.
Can I clarify, what are you proposing at the moment? Are you proposing that we only do it based on related observations, that we don't group things according to diagnostic reports, as some things might be grouped on diagnostic but not as related observations? Yeah, I think we're going to use a combination of the both. No, it's not an option of one or the other. It will be a combination of the two, maybe, with the component being less relevant to labs.
Yeah, so Munish, I was just going to come in and if I may, because I think that's exactly the answer. The problem is, if we leave option one open, we're going to have what I think is probably quite a critical data point, which is the group name potentially in quite different places in the FHIR structure. One is going to be in the diagnostic report and the other is in the observation code. And so I think there is that open question about the use of component. I don't think it will be required in labs, but there are some things like immunology where, occasionally there are tightly coupled sub-values. They're probably okay to handle as a flat battery or flat panel structure. But, I think you're right there. We should leave that open, but I think we should plump for either using the diagnostic report for panels or the observation header, repurpose the observation for the panel name, for the group name. Otherwise, we're going to have a bit of chaos. It does look as if FHIR version 4 is tending in the direction of using the observation in a way that we're suggesting, rather than using diagnostic report for panels. That was my reading of FHIR 4.
I guess for panels, I think it could be an either or thing, but there would still be groupings maybe of those panels within the diagnostic report. Say these were all done to get as part of a set. No.
Well, I'd be reluctant to go down that road. I think I would like to try to handle panels very consistently, so the panel name is always in a consistent resource.
No, I agree with that. I agree with the panels. It's just that within a diagnostic report that you may have more than one panel conducted.
Oh yeah, that's
so they would be all grouped together within the diagnostic report.
Yeah, we can do that. That's not a problem. So it's what the diagnostic report is effectively the top level structure for the document, and then everything else under that is going to be represented as observations.
Okay, so that makes sense in terms of having a kind of mutually exclusive approach to the panels.
It is confusing when you look at these things, because originally I think diagnostic report sort of equated to the OBR segment in HL7v2, which is much more like the panel header, but it seems to have drifted up the document in terms of FHIR thinking, and the representation of panels is now preferred to be in observations the way we've done it.
Okay, Jay, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just to say that is exactly how I think we should actually articulate our implementation guidance. I would strongly recommend our team, when they write the guidance, to take these scenarios and say, here's how we would expect each of these scenarios to work out, and specifically panels being a really tricky subject. But diagnostic report would be the place where I think the meaning should be, and the rest of the individual pieces should be, the components should be observations.
Okay. Right, so I think we're gonna, thanks for the comments, Ben, and I think we'll feed that in our implementation guidance. And we can handle multiple batteries linked to a diagnostic report, so that's not the issue. So your question, yes, I think as part of this meeting notes, the chat window comments will be included, so that's fine. Right, we've got 5 minutes left. Has anybody got any final comments, questions they would want to share before I close this call? Okay, if not, thanks for joining us today, and we'll share the recordings, and the notes and the presentation is already there. Please carry on conversation on Driver and Thread, which is the link you have there, and I hope you all have a good weekend. Bye now.
Thanks, Munish.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Munish.
Thank you.
Munish, before you disappear, sorry. Hello. Lots of things going on. Hey. Manish, can